Hello again, 102. In this video, we will begin Chapter 27, The New Frontiers, from 1960 to 1968. And the Kennedy-Nixon debates were held in the campaign of 1960. Nixon, the former vice president under Eisenhower, challenged his less prominent opponent to debates on the issues of the times, and it backfired on Nixon. And this is the first televised debate, and Kennedy's considered the first television president. He looked presidential. He was tanned. He had his makeup on. Nixon had been ill. He was perspiring. He looked splotchy on TV. He did not have any makeup on. And this went a long way towards getting Kennedy the victory in the election of 1960. This was the closest presidential race in history. The popular vote is basically only separated by about 100,000 votes. And this election symbolized a change because both Nixon and Kennedy, if Nixon had won, Kennedy won, and he's the first 20th century born president. And it's a time for a change in American politics. And Kennedy putting LBJ on his ticket really gave him the election. Those 24 electoral votes went a long way towards giving him the election. Even though Nixon won more states, the Electoral College vote was a little bit more decisive. He also had the big states of Pennsylvania and New York. And the New Frontier was the proposed domestic program championed by the incoming Kennedy administration in 1961 that aimed to jumpstart the economy and trigger social progress. And Kennedy was the first Roman Catholic elected president and the youngest man ever elected. And his inauguration ceremony on a cold, clear, blustery January day set the tone of youthful elegance, charm, and energy that would signify the Kennedy style. That's more what this era in the least few years are going to really be about. In his inaugural speech, the president quite intentionally spoke as the leader of a new generation of Americans, implying that Eisenhower had come to represent older Americans. Kennedy dazzled listeners with uplifting words. Let every nation know whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Wow, pretty broad-based and very encompassing. And there's Jack and Jackie. They were young, refined, and fabulous. The Kennedys were instant celebrities. Women teased their hair into the First Lady's famous hairdo. She's only 32 years old, while men craved JFK's effortless cool. Kennedy and civil rights is not going to be too spectacular a record at the beginning. And this is the most important development. We're going to spend a great deal of time on this in the 60s. And this is the most important area. And throughout the South, racial segregation remains firmly in place. And like Franklin D. Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower, John Fitzgerald Kennedy celebrated racial equality, but he did little to promote it until events, as we'll see, forced him to do so. And now there's a catastrophe in Cuba. Kennedy's record in foreign relations, as in domestic affairs, was mixed. And in this video, we're going to talk about the things that were problems. But they were very spectacular events that occurred in foreign affairs. Soon after his inauguration, Kennedy learned that a secret Central Intelligence Agency operation approved by Eisenhower was training 1,500 anti-Castro Cubans for an invasion of their homeland. U.S. military leaders assured Kennedy that the invasion plan, Operation Trinidad, was feasible. And Central Intelligence Agency's analysts naively predicted that news of the invasion would inspire anti-Castro Cubans to rebel against their communist dictator. And when the ragtag force, transported on American ships, landed before dawn at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's south shore on April 17, 1961, Castro's forces were waiting for them. And here are the captured forces. There is no indigenous uprising waiting to happen. And Kennedy refused to support this force with airstrikes. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories then about what happened. The clumsy effort to overthrow the Cuban government was a catastrophe. It humiliated Kennedy and elevated Castro in the eyes of the world. And a New York Times columnist reported that the Americans involved in the botched invasion looked like fools to our friends, rascals to our enemies, and incompetents to the rest. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev asked if Kennedy could really be that indecisive. To his credit, Kennedy admitted that the Bay of Pigs invasion was a colossal mistake and the worst experience of my life up to that point. And at the Vienna summit that takes place shortly after, Khrushchev will now try to take advantage of his inexperience, and he bullied the young president, and he threatened to limit American access to Berlin, the divided city inside communist East Germany. Kennedy confided to a journalist that the summit was awful, and now he's desperate to show his mettle. And he responded by calling up the Army Reserve and National Guard units, including my father, to protect West Berlin. And then on August 13th, 1961, the Soviets stopped all traffic between East and West Berlin and erected the Berlin Wall, a 27-mile-long symbol of the Cold War. And it was aimed at stopping the flow of East Germans fleeing to the free city of West Berlin. And for the United States, the wall becomes a powerful propaganda weapon. As Kennedy said, freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we've never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. And then Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, one of the whiz kids of the new youthful Kennedy administration, responded by embarking upon the most intensive arms race in history, increasing the number of nuclear missiles fivefold, adding 300,000 men to the armed forces, and creating the U.S. Special Forces, the Green Berets, an elite group of commandos specializing in guerrilla warfare who could provide a more flexible response than nuclear weapons to hotspots around the world, and enabled then the United States to wage small wars in faraway lands. And in contrast to the Eisenhower dullest emphasis on massive retaliation, Kennedy sought more flexibility. We intend to have a wider choice than humiliation or all-out war. And then missiles are discovered in Cuba, and we'll pick up there in part 2.